Now, usually when you read about a new scientific study in the news, you assume it's something to be concerned about. But we're about to explain with our science team, there are some headlines that are based on sketchy science.
And that is the name of our new segment here on Weekend Breakfast. And to kick it off, we are joined now by ABC Science reporter Jacinta Bowler in Adelaide. Jacinta, thanks for appearing on our very first Sketchy Science segment.
Thanks for having me.
Now let's talk about pesticides first. Now the federal court ruled this week that there's insufficient evidence to prove that the weed killer Roundup causes cancer. But there was also another paper that compared pesticide exposure to smoking when it comes to cancer risk.
Yeah, so this study that I wanted to talk about, it suggested that living in a community with high exposure to pesticides could be comparable to smoking on your cancer risk. Now, the research paper that was published in Frontiers in Cancer Control and Society looked at population data in 11 US states, and they looked at pesticide sales as well, and found that pesticide use, well, pesticide sales, I guess, was associated with an increased risk in cancers that was comparable to smoking. Now, pesticide risk, we know there is some evidence, and it has been really highly debated for years about whether pesticides actually increase your risk of cancer. Now, we know that it's not in eating foods. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. However, there may be a limited amount of evidence showing that working with pesticides could be an issue. Obviously, the federal court threw this out, so they don't believe there is, but there is some evidence that this might be the case. What the interesting thing about this, though, is the idea that it's as bad for you as smoking. That's a very, very big claim to have. A great group called the Australian Science Media Centre put out a call to see if they could find some experts to comment on this, particularly the smoking, angle. And the experts they found were not happy with this comparison at all. Professor Bernard Stewart, who works as a scientific advisor to the Cancer Council Australia, said that the idea that pesticides are potentially as bad as smoking is, and I quote, a little short of nonsense. So this one, I think, can definitely be put to bed.
All right, interesting. OK, let's go on to our second topic. What is the scientific knowledge on whether, this is a women's health issue, there is lead in tampons? It's often reported that there could be some danger. What's the science?
Yeah, this one I think is really scary, people who use tampons. You don't want to know that there's lead in there. There's lots of, they're used all the time. They're something that you don't really think about. And it is really scary. So I think this story is definitely worth talking about. And last week, quite a few news outlets ran a story about lead being found there. The source of this study itself isn't too sketchy. The original paper was from Environmental International. It found that 16 metals, including iron, lead, and arsenic, were found across 14 tampon brands in Europe, the US, and the UK. For lead, they found a median of 173 nanograms of lead per gram of tampon, and arsenic, it was 2.5 nanograms per gram of tampon. Now, this sounds really scary, and I wish that it wasn't the case, because as the researchers stated, the vagina has tissues which may be able to absorb these metals. But there's definitely been a lot of talk about this in media, and I don't think the whole story was got across. So as epidemiologist Gideon Marowitz-Katz has pointed out, there's about the same amount of lead in a tampon that you'd find in dried apples. And, no one has this problem with eating dried apples. The other thing that's worth noting here is that unlike dried apples, a tampon comes out of you relatively unchanged after it's done. The whole thing isn't being absorbed by the body. So likely what's happening here is the cotton is absorbing lead from the soil, and then this is getting put into the tampon. It's not like it's some kind of manufacturing process or anything like that. It's just, this is what happens. There's lead in soil. Sometimes it gets into things. And this is a really interesting study for, governmental bodies like the TGA or the FDA to look into whether there is a safe amount and whether this could potentially have any issues. But I don't think we should be worried about our tampons at this point.
All right, we're running out of time, Jacinta, but this final study is connecting belly fat with the risks of developing some diseases like Alzheimer's.
Yeah, so this last study I wanted to mention, it's published in Neurology, and it found that people with high levels of fat stored on their bellies and arms specifically may be more likely to develop diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Now, there were articles suggesting that if you tackle certain areas of fat when you hit the gym, you could lower your risk of these diseases. The researchers used data from a large group called the UK Biobank and found that belly and arm fat were associated with a higher rate of neurodegenerative diseases. But it's worth noting that it's very hard to remove fat from one area of your body. That's a myth. You can't do lots of sit-ups to get rid of tummy fat, for instance. The way we put on fat is mostly genetically determined. So, although this may be an interesting study for population-wide health measures, it's definitely not something you should focus on when you go to the gym. Mm-hmm. And I think all of these stories show that while it's important for science research to be out there in the mainstream, this is my job, it's what I want to do all the time, we need to be really careful about how we're publishing the information and how we're telling these stories as well.
All right, Jacinta Bowler, thank you so much for joining us for our very first Sketchy Science segment.
Thanks so much.